So let's continue taking a look at the elbow. Get a good idea of how it moves and the axis of rotation and the joint mechanics associated with normal motion at the elbow. So quickly to review, we do have the trochlea, which is on the anterior and medial aspect of the distal humerus. So the trochlea articulates with the trochlear notch in the ulna and contains the trochlear groove. So just a quick review from last time. So looking at the capitulum, which is the lateral convex surface of the distal end of the humerus here, and that articulates with the radial head. So when I'm looking at humeral ulnar joint mechanics, we have to consider that the joint surfaces are almost purely congruent. So with that roll and that glide, it really spins around. It spins around the trochlea. So when I'm looking at what limits the motion, extension is primarily limited by the olecranon process of the ulna as it makes contact in the olecranon fossa. So as I go into full extension, I can see that I have a fairly hard end feel. Feels pretty solid when I get to the end range, and that's a bone-on-bone end feel, and that's a normal end feel for elbow extension. And again, that's the olecranon process contacting the olecranon fossa. Flexion, on the other hand, is limited by the coronoid process as it contacts in the coronoid fossa. Now, sometimes you need to consider, though, in individuals with large amounts of muscle mass, that their forearm may contact their biceps before the coronoid process contacts the coronoid fossa. So I have to consider the type of end feel that's occurring. So in an individual with minimal muscle mass, that contact may be a relatively firm, hard end feel, similar to extension. But if I have soft tissue limitations, that end feel may simulate more of a soft end feel, may feel softer, more general, more muscle on muscle type of end feel. Now, the other component that we need to consider in flexion and extension in the humeral ulnar joint is in the humeroradial joint. So I need to consider the radial head as it moves on the humerus. And during radial flexion or elbow flexion, the radial head is going to glide on the capitulum. So it, again, is occurring primarily just in flexion, looking at the concave surface of the radial head on the convex surface of the capitulum. Roll and glide is occurring in the same direction, and again, contact is made primarily just during flexion. As I go into extension, there is a distractive force, and with that distractive force comes a lack of articulation and a lack of contact between the radial head and the capitulum. So less or minimal or no contact during extension. As I move into flexion, I start to get more of a compressive force, and the radial head glides on the capitulum. Just to quickly review our elbow joints, again enclosed by one capsule, the lateral side reinforced by the lateral collateral ligament, and which is a broad ligament blending with the annular ligament. Medial side reinforced by the medial collateral ligament made up of the three bands, the anterior, the oblique, and the posterior. So let's look at this concept of the axis of motion. So the axis is relatively fixed, passing through the center of the capitulum and the trochlea. So here is the axis passing through the capitulum and the trochlea. So we can see that that is not in a perfectly horizontal line. It's slightly offset. And that offset creates what we call the carry angle. In men, the carry angle averages about 5 degrees. And in women, it's about 15 degrees. So if I'm standing in an anatomical position, I can see a forearm that angulates outward about 5 degrees in men and about 15 degrees in women. When I take the forearm into pronation, you can do this, standing at your side, thumb out in supination. We can visualize our carry angle. When we move into pronation, we turn our thumb to your hip. That carry angle disappears. So we no longer have the carry angle. Normal range of motion for the elbows, 0 to 150 degrees. But there are a number of things that will affect normal range. One is the type of motion. Is it passive or is it active? So I run out of motion actively in the elbow well before I run out of motion passively. And we have to consider why that occurs. And again, remembering that active insufficiency and our cross bridges running out of available sites, we start to lose the ability to generate enough force in full flexion. So I can take my hand up in actively, and I can typically get another 5 to 10, even 15 degrees into flexion passively. Again, it also depends on the muscle mass. So active, passive, size of the muscle mass surrounding the joint will all influence the type of motion that we get. Another component that will have a big impact on elbow motion is the position of the shoulder. Again, when I have muscles that cross multiple joints, like the triceps, like the biceps brachii, that muscle is influenced by both elbow position and shoulder position. So a shoulder that's taken into full extension with a tight biceps may limit elbow extension, secondary to the passive insufficiency. As we talked about before, if I take an elbow into full flexion, I start to run out of opportunities for cross bridges to connect. Same time, if I take the shoulder into flexion, I may lose an even greater tension. So a position of full elbow flexion and full shoulder flexion will influence my ability. And again, when I look at full flexion, I may have tightness through the triceps, which is a shoulder extensor as well as an elbow extensor. So if I'm taking the shoulder into full flexion, I may lose my ability to fully flex the elbow, secondary to tightness in the triceps. Now, another component that will impact motion at the elbow is the position of the forearm. So when I have a position in supination, I will tend to have a greater range of motion at the elbow than I do when I am in a forearm pronated position. And this occurs secondary to the way it helps to wind up the ligamentous structures. So again, normal range of motion, 0 to 150 degrees. Pretty significant range, though. Could be as little as 135 degrees of flexion all the way up to 160 degrees. So quite a bit of normal variance occurs in the elbow range of motion. When I look at closed pack position of the joint, closed pack position is in full extension, and that's when I have the greatest bony contact in the in the humeral ulnar joint, and the ligaments are in their most taut position. So full extension, I've got a nice rigid solid elbow. Thinking about what position we can load the joint most effectively in during a handstand or a press up, that position becomes a fully extended position, similar to the knee. When I look at the radial ulnar joint, proximal rim of the radius of the radial head articulates with the notch of the radius, or the radial notch in the ulna, and that's reinforced by the annular ligament. The annular ligament is here, which is again cup-shaped. Now, with enough distractive force, we can dislocate the radius from the radial ulnar joint, and we'll hear that term nursemaid's elbow with when we yank on children's wrist or hand, and it's relatively easy to dislocate that joint. So you have to be careful when you're swinging kids in holding onto them by their wrists, whether it's in fun or you're yanking them along. Relatively easy to dislocate the proximal radial ulnar joint. So the distal radial ulnar joint is where the ulnar notch of the radius articulates with the disc and the head of the ulnar. And we talked a little bit about this triangular shaped disc previously, and when we were talking a little bit about the wrist and hand. And the ulnar notch is concave and the disc is attached along the inferior edge. So we have this triangular shaped disc with its base at the radial notch and its apex attached to the styloid process of the ulna. The entire thing is supported by the annular ligament, the oblique cord, the quadrate ligament, and the anterior and posterior radial ulnar ligaments. So when I look at the joint axis for the forearm, the axis runs from the capitulum through the ulnar styloid process. So the motion that occurs is really at the radial head proximally, and as the radius translates over the ulnar head distally. So normal range of motion is 150 to 160 degrees from a fully supinated position to a fully pronated position. And when I look at what a neutral position looks like, if your elbow's bent at 90 degrees and your hand's straight out like you were going to shake somebody's hand, thumbs straight towards the sky, that's a neutral position. So if I turn my palm up, that's supination, and that's about 90 degrees. If I turn my palm down, that's pronation, and I get 60 to 70 degrees. So that's the motion that occurs at the radial ulnar joint, both proximal and distal, because they're directly linked. Distally, though, I have to take into account this this unique joint that includes the concave surface of the ulnar notch on the radius. So this surface here, which is concave, and the articular disc and the head of the ulna. So the articulating surface of the distal radial ulnar joint, again, includes that notch, includes the disc, and includes the head of the ulna. The ulnar notch runs on the radius along the interosseous border. So remember, I have an interosseous membrane connecting the radius and the ulna through the forearm, which provides strength, stability, and mobility, and dissipation of forces. Now the radius of the curve of the concave ulnar notch is larger than the size of the ulnar head, and that allows for this attachment of the disc. And the articular disc runs along the radius, and sometimes this disc is called the triangular fibrocartilage, or TFC. But when I take into consideration the other ligamentous attachments, we will sometimes call this the TFCC, or the triangular fibrocartilage complex. So this disc is really described as a shelf with a medial border that's embedded in a wedge of vascular tissue. So I have a large vascular supply. And then the base of the articular disc is attached to the distal edge of the ulnar notch here, with the apex attaching to the fovea of the ulnar head and to the base of the ulnar styloid process. So what happens is I end up with a disc that creates a biarticulation where the surface is concave on each side, which allows for the convex surface of the ulna to articulate with a concave surface on the disc, and a concave surface distally on the disc articulating with a convex surface on the proximal row of carpals. So that's what kind of transpires, and anatomically what we need to consider when looking at forearm motion. And when I go into pronation and I go into supination, we have to consider that the radius spins over the ulna, and that the disc will fold from being in a flattened position in neutral to as the radius rolls over the ulna, the disc then allows a spin or a folding to occur to provide stability between the radius and the ulna. Now, unfortunately, sometimes this ligament and this disc will become injured, and in individuals with an ulnar collateral ligament injury, sometimes that TFCC becomes injured and requires extensive surgical debridement and reconstruction. It's a long rehab. I've rehabbed a number of them, and they are require a tremendous amount of work to return normal function. Very complex joint. So let's take a look quickly at motions and see if we can identify the axis of rotation and the mobility that occurs in these joints. So taking a look at elbow extension, we can see the triceps, all three heads, working in conjunction with the anconeus. So anconeus working as an extensor. We have the axis of rotation occurring through the trochlea and the capitulum, with the medial, lateral, and long head working to extend the elbow. So elbow extension. Looking at elbow flexion, we can see the biceps, long head, biceps, short head, brachialis, and the brachioradialis working synergistically to create elbow flexion. And again, looking at that axis, as we go into flexion, we will have a slight deviation towards the midline. As we go into extension, we have a slight deviation away from the midline, and that alludes to our carry angle. And a carry angle, again, does go away when we go into a pronated position. Okay, taking a look at forearm pronation, our primary muscles responsible for forearm pronation include the pronator teres and the pronator quadratus. And remember that axis of rotation occurs from the head of the radius proximally, moving diagonally down and inserting or moving through the head of the ulna. Now, another muscle that's on here that we need to take into account is the brachioradialis. And the brachioradialis is a muscle that is responsible for pronation from there to there. So I can go backward and start from a supinated position, and the contraction of the brachioradialis will take the forearm to a neutral position here, at which point it no longer serves as a pronator, because when we get to that end range pronated position and start to come back, it becomes a supinator to neutral. So the brachioradialis really does play two roles. It plays a role as a pronator to neutral and a supinator to neutral. Now, looking at supination, I have the biceps brachii, both the short head and the long head, with their common attachment into the radial tuberosity of the ulna. So that works as a supinator in addition to being a forearm flexor. Again, we talked about the brachioradialis, and we have the supinator. So moving from a pronated position to a supinated position. So we have a better view of the supinator from a posterior position. So its attachment along the ulna up onto the ridge of the radius, pulling the radius back into that supinated position. So from a pronated position to neutral, brachioradialis, long head, short head of the biceps brachii, working as a supinator, and the supinator muscle itself. So those are the muscles that are responsible for motion at the forearm and the elbow. Again, though, let's keep in mind what transpires in a closed chain environment. So if I fix my hand, my bicep may in fact become an elbow extensor, similar to what transpires in the knee during gait, where I may slow down the rate of flexion, really actually creating extension from what I would typically think of in a flexor muscle. So just a little little fuel for thought, and you know, keeping in mind that we need to consider how muscles are loaded and what their primary objective is during motion, and how we're going to achieve our ultimate intentional goals with our upper extremity. Next time, we'll start taking a look at the shoulder and how it impacts motion, and finish up with integrating the entire complex together, and ultimately looking at how the entire chain works from the ground up. So, until next time.